Ben and the Bantam by Edwin Waugh, narrated by Malc, Cowle. Chapter 2. Poor fellow, he'd a deal of heart, but very little head. Benjamin Preston. Ben was so ashamed of the freak of the previous day that he listened silently to the admonitions of his wife, pretending all the while to be arranging the things in the panniers. But the poor fellow heard it all, and every word woke up a fresh pang of shame within him. The only reply he made was when she concluded with the inevitable words, "And do mind what they're doing now. Dost a hear?" Ben pricked his ears at the words, as he stood there like a shy lad, smarting under the reprimand of his schoolmaster, and as he fumbled with his teeth at an imaginary knot on the end of his whiplash, he muttered in reply to his wife, "Aye, I hear." "Well, for God's sake, heed then," answered Betty, "and dunna go and make thyself into a country-sized talk. Have a bit of wit, for childer's sake. Dost a hear?" "Aye, I hear," replied Ben. "Well then, do, I beg on thou, tak care. Thou'll find thy dinner on bottom o' basket. Now, thou'll get back soon, winna thou?" "Yai, I will," replied Ben, giving the donkey a switch and beginning to whistle a low tune. "Well, I'll come down a meeting thou. Thou'll be back before 4:00, winna thou?" "Aye, long afore that," replied Ben, "long afore that, if all leets reet. But I'll meet thou theer by that time, as how it is." It is well that Betty pushed the thing no further, for the water was rising into Ben's eyes as he walked slowly on by the side of his donkey, kicking at bits of stone in the road and making a tremulous attempt at whistling, which came sputtering from his lips as if his mouth was full of peas. Betty knew what was going on in his heart as well as if it had been her own, and she began to think that she'd spoken too roughly to him, and she sighed as she followed the poor fellow down the old bridle path. Perhaps there are few in the world who have parted, even for a short time, from those they loved, without the heart being touched with some shadowy thought of the inevitable hour when they return no more. "I think I'll go no furrer," said she. "I mun turn back to Childer." And she stopped and watched him wandering on. But as he drew near to a turn in the road around which he would be out of sight, she cried out, "Well, good morning to thou." "Good morning," replied Ben, giving a sly glance back and playing with his whiplash. In another minute he disappeared, and as Betty stood gazing at the vacant road, all the tenderness of her nature welled up within her. Turning away towards home again, she wiped her eyes and sighed, for her heart was full. As soon as she reached the cottage, she went upstairs to the children. Little Billy was sitting up in bed playing with his wooden horse. The younger child was still asleep. Snatching Billy up in her arms, she clasped him to her breast, and she sat down upon the bedside and burst into tears. The child gazed into his mother's face, and stretching his little round arms up to clip his mother's neck, he cried, "Mam, mam, mam," weeping as if his little heart would break. This woke up the younger child, and it began to cry. Still holding Billy in her arms, she flew to it and sat down by its side, trying to soothe first one then the other of her weeping children. "Hush, my love," said she, happing the clothes about it. "Come, hush, my darling." And as she swayed to and fro, caressing the little things by turns, the tears came dreeping from her eyes upon the bedclothes, like raindrops from a wind-shaken rosebush. It was some time before the storm of feeling had swept by, and Betty's heart was relieved. But at last the younger child became silent, and Billy had sobbed himself to sleep again, with his thumb in his mouth. Betty laid the sleeping lad down in bed again, by the side of his brother, and when she'd drawn the clothes about them, took a long look at their faces and then crept away, and all the little house was still, for the poor woman went very quietly from side to side about her work. Opening the kist where Ben's clothes lay, she took them out one by one, and examined them and brushed them, and then refolded them and put them carefully by again, with a few fresh sprigs of lavender strewn amongst them. Meanwhile, Ben was wandering on his way towards the main road in the valley, still touched at heart with a little sadness. As he descended the hillside, he left the stillness of the lonely moors farther behind, and drew nearer to morning sounds of life in the green valley. The bridle path led through a grove of fir trees, where the sunshine lay in straggled streaks of gold on a shady bank, flush with a sky of bluebells. The moorland stream ran through this grove, and Ben sat himself down by the water to tie his shoes again, and to look about him. Dimple had stopped of his own accord when he saw Ben sit down. They were great lingerers in the quiet paths, these two wayfaring friends. As Ben sat playing with a bluebell and listening to the pleasant sounds which rose on every hand, he said, as he looked dreamily through an opening in the trees, "I don't know I ever seed a grander time than this, never. I wish how Donna Dolly's would start a cutting. I could like a 2-3 day amongst they. Thou lad happen thinks this weather's bound to last forever, but I begin this very day if I were him. All things has but a time, all things has but a time in this world," continued he, rising to his feet. "Come up, Dimple, let's be going a bit further." As they started lazily away, Ben sighed as he stuck a sprig of thorn blossom into his buttonhole and began to sing. Now, of course, by now, you, dear listener, will know that this particular narrator cannot sing, so you'll just have to make the best of it. Good Lorgeous days, what change there is upon this mortal ground! As time goes creeping o'er one's yet, how queerly things come round. The ups and downs, the ins and outs, the blending ill and weal. There is one poor creature's life, it is not for to tell. Ben's store of country song was replete with quaint and varied scraps, as varied as the changeful mood of his own mind, and as he emerged from the grove into full view of the valley, he switched his whiplash carelessly from side to side, and chanted again as he gazed around with delight. I know not, I care not, I cannot tell how to woo, but we'll away to the merry greenwood, and we'll get nuts enough. Ben's heart got more cheerful as he got lower into the vale, where the haymakers were singing at their work in the meadows, and all the world was smiling in its flowery summer robe. The ridge of the opposite hill, like that he had left behind, was bleak moorland, but the low grounds were nearly all green pasture and meadow lands. The wild rose warmed the thick-leaved edges with its simple beauty. Birds were singing in every bush and tree, and Ben, as he lounged along with a heart attuned to the music of nature, broke out again. "Tumposy come a decent folk, o' the good oud moorland breed, a sounder sweeter looking lad no mortal ever seed. He stood 6 feet, his een were breet, his voice were loud and clear, but Tom could whisper soft and sweet into a woman's ear." And thus, as he went singing and sauntering down towards the main road in the valley, he stopped an instant again to peep through the edge at a number of haymakers at work in a meadow hard by. It was a pleasant sight to Ben, and there are few people in the world who can look upon it without delight. The farmhouse stood at the head of the meadow, and a stout old woman came to the door, and shading her eyes from the sun with her hands, she shouted down the meadow to the haymakers in her shrill voice, "Come to your breakfast, lads." Down went rake and scythe, and the haymakers straggled up the grassy slope, laughing and chattering together on their way to their morning meal. "I wish I were among that lot," said Ben, rubbing his hands. He watched them till the last had disappeared, and then he cracked his whip and went his way again. When Ben came out upon the high road near the little hamlet of Facet, he became thoughtful, for as he looked towards the cluster of houses he had to pass, he felt afraid that the Facet folk might have heard of the foolish adventure he'd been engaged in on the previous day. Laying hold of the donkey's bridle, he stopped. Then he scratched his head and looked round, as if he would rather have gone some other way, so as to avoid the hamlet. "I made no account of going through that hole this morning," said he, "but it's like to be done. I'm on call at Bull's Head with these things." And he might well be afraid, for though the hamlet consisted of only half a dozen houses or so, in addition to the old inn, the inhabitants were too curious to let anything go by without scrutiny, and very seldom, too, without some rude comment. The chief danger was at the Bull's Head. Houses of that kind were rare upon that then comparatively lonely road, and though the population, with the exception of the inhabitants of the half-dozen dwellings about the alehouse, was very thin and widely scattered, the Bull's Head was not often without company. Carters, sportsmen, farmers, and other country folk from solitary nooks of the hills around, many of them people who lived partly by farming and partly by woollen weaving, which last was done at their own houses in those days. Our poor besom maker was an unusually sensitive man. His neighbours knew this very well, and for the most part they could not understand it. Many of them looked upon that strange sensibility of his as something especially unaccountable in one of his position of life. A kind of disease, in fact, which needed more than usual rough treatment, and this was a view which the natural simplicity of the man helped to strengthen. Ben was afraid of the Bull's Head, for he knew his customers, but he had to leave his besoms and eggs and herbs there, so at last he took heart of grace and went forward, determined not to enter the house. As he drew nearer, he saw that 3 carts, heavily laden with stone from the delfts in the neighbourhood, stood in front of the inn, and he was glad of it, for they partly screened the windows. But when he got a little nearer still, he heard loud peals of laughter inside, and the sound went through him like a knife, for he imagined himself the subject of that boisterous merriment. He thought it possible that he might get by safely under the cover of the carts in front of the house, if he only had his goods delivered, and he was just thinking of creeping around the corner to hand them in at the back door, when his plan was changed. An old broken-down serving man or hanger-on called Doddy of Flutters, who acted as brewer, ostler, messenger, scavenger, and man-of-all-work, was holding up a bucket of water to the mouth of one of the horses at the door, when, hearing footsteps on the road, he looked off at the side of the horse's head, and setting the bucket down, he cried out, "Hallo, Ben, old mon, is that thee? Thou'rt just in time. They're having a rare do in Thinside here." "Husht," replied Ben, raising his whip and pulling up behind the carts. "Hold thy din, for God's sake. Sing low and come here. I don't want 'em to see me. Come here." "What? They met as well, Cowle," said Doddy, limping up to Ben on the sheltered side of the carts. No, I tell her," replied Ben. "Thou knows what macadevils they are when they startin'. Besides, I've no time this morning. Where's landlord?" "He's in tap room," answered Doddy, "where Rooka Carter's and I put her out for bake-up. He's just telling about that bit of a do tha'd wi' a winding jackass up into mill chamber yesterday." "By mon," said Ben, "I thought as much. They'm getting summat to play off now. I don't call this morning, Doddy, but I'll tell thou what do. Just take these besoms and that basket, slyly in at back door to mistress. There's a lot of eggs under yarbs in basket. Mind those eggs, Doddy. The mistress knows what they comin' to. I'll watch here till I brings brass. Now dunna go and tell yon t'others." "Aye, yeah," replied the old man, and away he limped with the besoms and the basket, round the house end and in at the back door, to the landlady in the kitchen. "Lobden Ben's yon we's jackass," said he with a chuckle. "He's brought these besoms, where mun I put 'em, and that basket with eggs in. He says you know 'em what they are, and he's watching for brass at back at some carts yon. He begged on me not to tell Meister." "Well, mind tha doesn't then," replied the landlady. The landlady was a well-grown, buxom country woman, with good common sense and a kind heart. "Here," continued she, plunging her hand into her pocket, "I'll come to him out at back. Doddy, put those besoms down at door, and then go and bring him to th' house end. I'll be there in a minute. Mary, fill a pint o' ale." The old man went to the house end, and beckoning to Ben, who stood whistling low as he turned over the things in his panniers, he called to him off the side of his hand, "Who's coming to nook here? Bring thy jackass." Ben looked carefully round. Then he drew Dimple up to the corner, just as the landlady came sailing down from the back door with a white cap string streaming behind her head. Ben," said she, "whatever were thou doing to go and mak such a fool of thyself and that bit of the jackass yesterday? What, thou never yet last on it, mon? Here," continued she, handing the pint of ale to him, "get that into thou. I thought tha'd had more wit. How's Betty and childer?" "They're all right," replied Ben, unbuttoning the lowermost button of his waistcoat and then buttoning it up again. "They're all right. Now but Billy, he's getting a bit of a nouse-cowed. His mother missed him one day, and who found him up to middling waterstead, reckoning to fish with a long pipe of his granny's. He's such a lad for water as never were." "Poor thing," said she. "He's a pratty lad. Thou should let him come down now and then for a change. These lasses are tak care on him, Mum. Here, I'll pay for these things. See thou, there's 3 shilling. Hast thou any o' round?" "Aye." "And tansy?" "Plenty." "Well, bring some next time thou comes down. But call to-night. I think I can shap a bit of a frock for Billy. And let's see, Tommy O'Plungers wants 4 besoms. I'll pay thou for 'em now, if thou likes." "Nay," replied Ben, "I'll ha' noan at brass till I bring stuff." "Well," said she, "it makes no matter, but tell Betty to come down to her tay and bring childer, wilt her?" "Aye, I will, and thank you," said Ben, turning his donkey's head towards the road again. "Well, mind thou does," said the landlady, "and off with thou now," said she, calling after him. "Off with thou, or they'n torment thy life out. And do tak care of thyself, lad." In a minute he disappeared behind the carts, and was going quietly up the road, hoping to escape in peace from the wassailers in the tap-room. "Poor Ben," said the landlady, looking up the road after him. "Poor Ben, a decent lad, very." And then, as soon as he got behind the cart, she whisked round and ran back into the kitchen. "Now, lasses," said she, nipping up the poker and beginning to scale the ashes from the lower bars of the grate, "it's time to be shapping for dinner. Bless my life, it'll be noon afore one knows where they are. Do stir ye. How's yon parlour fire? Mary, go thee and look at it. We'n 6 to get ready for be 1 o'clock. I wonder what you're thinking on. Sam, go thee into t' garden this minute, and get some pot yarbs and some potatoes, and 2-3 carrots and turmits. Dost ye hear? Off without. Thou'rt like a snail trailing up and down. Tell Doddy I want him, some on you. Mary, hast to getting that bagging ready for th' field yet? Set off to Meadows with it as fast as ever you can. Sally, thee help her to carry it. Where's that lad gone, young devilman that he is? He's always wit lane when he should be in field, that he is. Fill that boiler up, some on you. You should never be short of water in a house like this. That's the parlour bell. Come, I'll go. And away she ran, returning in a minute and beginning again. Mary, 2 glasses of brandy in parlour. Stir thyself, my lass. Then setting her hands upon her hips and looking thoughtfully at the fire, she continued, These coals are nothing as good as t'other, and the same price. Was I to try another pit next time? Put some naplings under that pond. Sam, reach that beef down, Wilter, and then off with thou into yard and pluck those chickens. Which on yo's laughed this bucket here for folks to break their shins on? I wonder when you and larn sense. Away with it this minute. Give me a clem brat out of that drawer. I mun start to me pies. Sally, what a seat thou's made of thyself. Wipe thy nose, mon. There's black tick whip pon. Now then, they're knocking in tap room. Come, I'll go. Look to that oven, some on you. And away she went. She'd no sooner got out of the room than one of the girls began to mimic her. Sam, clean those tunes. Sally, side those glasses. Doddy, fetch some coals. Who's left on brush bont table? Mary, cats agate of yon pickles again. That's the parlour. As the landlady came into the kitchen again, the girl stopped suddenly, and there was a crash in the tap room. Hullo, said the landlady. That's another glass broken. Come, I'll go. Yon's a weary lot. Meanwhile, Ben was creeping by the front as quietly as possible, when the landlord, who was standing with uplifted hands in the tap room, roaring with laughter amongst the rest, caught a glimpse of him just as he was disappearing. By mass, cried the landlord, he's yon, the jackass and all. Nay, I'll baint naught at it. Let's have him in, cried 2 or 3 of the company. Come, I'll fetch him back, said the landlord, running out with all the company at his heels. Hey, Ben, shouted the landlord, where to for? Here, I've an order for thou. Just a minute, come. But Ben jogged on, and pointing ahead with his whip, he cried out, Shay Clough, I'm behind in me time. Then seizing Dimple's bridle, he gave the poor beast a smart switch. Stir those legs of thine, said he. I want no truck with yon lot. First one and then another cried out for him to stop, but Ben held on his way. He's for off for naught else, said one of the carters who stood in the middle of the road, staring after Ben with his whip in one hand and a pint pot in the other. He'll have known, I believe, said the landlord, scratching his head. I could have liked to have had a bit of gam out on him. Stop, I'll see if I cannot fetch him back. And away he ran after Ben. The poor fellow heard him coming, and he didn't like it, but he knew it was no use running. And then Dimple was not accustomed to galloping, except when he was returning home, or when he took a fit of it to please himself, and Ben could not find in his heart to beat him to it. So the landlord overtook him, and laying hold of one of the panniers, he said, What's all thy hurry? I want thou to run out to Miller's with a Bantam. It isn't a bun a mile, and I'll give thou a shilling. Our folks are all in thay, or else at a cent Sam. Well, replied Ben as he turned Dimple round, I've not again doing that, but I'm no bound into th' house this morning. There's no occasion if there doesn't like, answered the landlord, walking demurely by the side of the donkey. No, they mun be as sharp as they can, and I want now to call with a bit of a note at Billy Fairhoff's at Lane's side. As they came near the house, the landlord gave a sly hint to the carters at the door that they were to be silent and go inside, which they did at once, for they knew him well enough to think he had better sport in store for them. But they made Ben uneasy by staring at him through the window. First one, then another rapped and cried, Come in, holding up their pots by way of inducement. But Ben laid hold of his donkey's bridle, as if it was the one sheet anchor that could keep him from drifting into mischance. The landlord tried to persuade him too, but Ben stuck to Dimple and would not enter the house. "Wait here then," said the landlord, "and I'll bring it out." In a few minutes he came to the door again with a bag in his hand and a bantam cock under his arm. "Tak out of this bread," said he, handing the bantam to Ben. "Now put it into that bag and tee it up and tag it down to Miller's. And say thou mun call upon road at Bill Fairhoff's with this note. The lad to bring an answer back. Now be sharp, and there's a shilling for that. Never mind tacking jackass, I can fasten it to ring at door here." But Ben did not relish the idea, and he said he would rather take Dimple with him. "Well, off with you together then," replied the landlord, "and dunna be long now." Away went the simple-minded besom maker down the road, between the thick-leaved hawthorn hedges, delighted with the splendours of the day. He felt glad, also, to earn a shilling so easily. The wild birds carolled to him all the way, as if he was a kindred spirit, and at last Ben himself broke out into song, as usual when he was alone and in the green country. And thus he sauntered along in the sunshine, chanting quaint fragments of minstrel memories of days gone by, and cracking his whip and fondling the wild flowers upon the edge-side with unconscious tenderness. Rather more than half a mile on the way there was a substantial stone-built cottage at the head of a sloping garden by the roadside. 2 steps led up to a green-painted wooden gate, which opened into the garden. Close by the road, and embedded in the grassy bank below the garden hedge, there was a mossy well trough, into which an unseen rindle of spring water came down from somewhere, and the low tingling music it played was clear as the ring of a fairy's moonlight festal bell. To the bended listener's appreciative ear, its silvery cymbal chimes rose and fell in cadences of such exquisite beauty that the bright ferns which festooned that little recess seemed to thrill with delight as they listened to the tiny minstrel's melody, interlacing their leaves as if to screen it from the noisy world outside. This roadside cottage was the place where queer old Billy Fairhoffs lived. Billy was a hearty, waggish fellow who had been a farmer and an innkeeper on the road, but who had now retired from business. The old man sat smoking in the front parlour, with the window open, and when he saw Ben stop at the gate, he came out with his pipe in his mouth. "Well, Ben, my lad," said he, giving a long puff into the air, "what's up?" "I brought a note from Jem at Bull's Yed," replied Ben, handing the document to old Billy, "and I'm to wait for an answer." Old Billy's eyes began to twinkle, for he had received many a note from his crony at the Bull's Head before, and they generally meant some kind of humorous mischief, which Billy delighted in above all things. "Come in," said he, putting the note into his pocket, and Ben followed him through the garden into the front parlour. "Sit thou down," continued Billy, pointing to a chair at the back of the room. "Wilt have a gill o' ale?" "I dunna care if I have," replied Ben. "Well, I'll be back directly," said Billy, walking slowly out and closing the door behind him. When he got into the kitchen, he said to his wife, who was a little deaf, "Dost ye, lass, tak a pint of ale to yon chap in parlour and keep him in talk 2-3 minutes." "Aye, yeah," replied the old woman, and as she went out, he closed the door quietly behind her, and then opening an old corner cupboard, he took out a bag very like the one Ben had brought the bantam in, and lifting something from the sofa, he whipped it into the bag, and when he tied the mouth up, he went out at the back door. Creeping round to the front of the house, he took the bag from Dimple's pannier, replacing it with the one he had brought, and then, after leaving Ben's bag in a little outhouse, he sidled back into the parlour again. "Well, Ben," said he, "how dost thou like that ale?" "Oh," replied Ben, "nice ale enough, rayther new." "Yai, it is," answered Billy. "Well," continued the old man, "thou mun call as thou comes back from Miller's, and I'll ha' the answer ready." And the old man followed Ben out at the front and down to the garden gate. "I'll not be above 20 minutes," said Ben, looking back as he started up the road. "All right," replied Billy, "I'll have it ready." And then he went back into the house, rubbing his hands with delight. A few minutes brought Ben to the end of a shady lane on the left hand, leaning down to the miller's house, which stood near the brook in the hollow between the road and the hillside. "Whoa," said Ben, stopping Dimple at the gate. Then, taking the bag from the pannier, he walked up to the open door of a great low-roofed kitchen, which was all aglow with cleanliness and comfort. "Is Miller in?" said Ben to the miller's wife, who stood in the doorway. "Aye," replied she, "he is yon in th' arm-chair. You and let better than likely too. He should have been at mill, but he sprained his ankle a bit with jumping off they move yesterday." Then, turning to her husband, she said, "There's some mack of a chap with a jackass here. He wants to speak to thou. He's a bag in his hand. Come for'ard," continued she, turning to Ben. "Come for'ard and wipe your shoon." The miller turned round in his chair, and seeing Ben, he said, "Hallo, is that thee, old lad? What hast to get him?" "Jem at Bull's Yed sent your Bantam cock," replied Ben, holding out the bag, as he walked towards the miller. "Oh, aye," said the miller, winking to his wife. "Well, come for'ard and shut the door after them. Now then, take it out and let's have a look at it." The miller's 2 daughters and a lad about 10 years old came into the kitchen from an inner door. "It's as pratty a bantam," said Ben, untying the bag, "as ever I clapped in on." "Well," replied the miller, "pull it out, lad, and let's see what it's like." "In half a minute," answered Ben, taking the string off. "It's a nice coloured un, too," continued he, putting his hand into the bag to take the bantam out. But in an instant his countenance changed, and whipping his hand out again, he cried, "Oh, by mass, what's that?" "What's to do now?" said Miller. "Has it bitten thou?" "Bitten me?" replied Ben. "It's scrapped me and ill too. It's naught to laugh at, I can tell you. Look there," continued he, holding up his hand. "Well," answered the miller, staring at Ben's hand with an air of assumed surprise, "it caps the dirl if a bantam cock can scratter that sharp." "Bantam a boggart," replied Ben, putting his hand to his mouth. "It scrapped me and a boon a bit too. You can see for yourself," continued he, holding his hand up again. "There's a pattern there." "Pull the divil skin out," said the miller, "and let's look at it. Pull it out. Will it have teeth, think'st? "Well, it's bitten me," said Ben, looking at his hand again. "It's bitten me, teeth and no teeth." "By mon," continued Miller, "rive it out." "Here," answered Ben, offering the bag to the miller. "Pull it out yourself, I'll have no more." "Will it be a guinea pig, think'st?" said Miller. "Guinea pig or halfpenny pig," replied Ben, "I'll poo no more, by mon. It'd like to pooed me into t' bag. Here, tak out," continued he, holding the bag to the miller. "Tak out, it's noan of mine." "Nay, nay," said the miller, laughing. "Doesn't thou see I have sprained me ankle?" "Well," answered Ben, laying the bag on the table, "I don't want you to get out on it with your foot. It's there. You can help yourself to it when you're in a mind. I'll be going." "Shake the bag out," cried the miller, "and let it lead on floor, as what it is." "Come, I can do that," replied Ben, laying hold of the bottom of the bag and flinging the open end towards the hearthstone on which the miller's terrier lay half asleep. Out rolled a black cat with blazing eyes, and alighting upon the dog's back, it flew at it instantly. The terrier sprang instantly upon his foe and shook it. Grimmel King kept her talons going with great vigour, clawing her antagonist with tigerish fury. The worry and the spitfire scuffles of the combatants were wildly exciting. The din of battle rolled to and fro about the kitchen with vivid speed, now under the table, now in a corner, now between the miller's legs, who sat watching the affray with all the calmness of an Olympian god, overlooking some fierce bit of mortal strife. At last he could stand it no longer, and seizing his crutch he shuffled after the fight, sweeping a jug from the table which shivered upon the edge of a mug full of dough upon the hearth. The crash seemed to revive the fury of the contest. "Go it, Nip," cried the miller, "go it out, lad, or else thou'rt done for. Thou's let to thy match out, lad." The girl screamed, and the lad ran up and down after the combatants, who seemed mixed up together. Ben, who had got upon a chair at the beginning of the fray, jumped down and cried out as he ran to seize the dog, "Nate back, mon, I'm no bound to ston here and see a cat worried." "Let him alone," said the miller. "Thou dog hasn't a tooth in his yed, mon. Let him alone." And certainly Nip had very much the worst of it, in spite of his wiry armour, for he was old and almost toothless. But this sudden attack upon his slumbers by a strange cat, and on his own hearthstone too, had revived his wonted fires in an extraordinary way. But he began to show signs of distress, and when the cat ran up to the top of the clock case and sat there mewing and glaring round with eyes that glowed like melted gold, the old dog came puffing to the hearth again, but wagging his tail and snorting with joy at having won the field. The miller's wife had been swelling the tumult with screams of fright and indignation all the while it was going on, but it was not till a lull came that her shrill voice rose above the storm. "I'll not have such goings on," cried she. "Look what lumber you have made. Robert," continued she, turning to the miller, "I wonder at there's no more wit." Then she flew at poor Ben, who stood in the doorway, looking as penitent as if he'd been the sole cause of the row. "Go thee wone with thy cat," said she, "and be sharp. Here, tap thy bag and bout. We want a naughty cat line, so thou may take thyself off where thou come fra as fast as thou con." "It's noan of my cat," replied Ben. "Jem at Bull's Yed sent it, and it were a Bantam cock when it started off." "Aye, and I'll Bull's Yed him when I leet on him. He may keep his cats a home. We can manage what mice we han here nicely, and we can do our own scratting too bout ony of his cats. Tell him I say so. John, open that door. I'll shift that cat, and soon too." And then she took up the long brush to drive the cat from the top of the clock case. At the first thrust of the brush head, Puss, seeing the door open, jumped down upon the dresser and flew out at the door, with the dog after it, and the lad after the dog, and Ben after the lad. The miller took up his crutch and followed them, with the bag in his hand. As he went out, he said to his wife, "I think thou'rt making a fool of thyself, aren't thou?" "I think thou'rt a ready maiden to allow such work," replied she. Ben stood waiting in the road by the side of his donkey. "Thou better go a bit fur up lane, out at seat of this woman of ours," said the miller to Ben, "or else there'll be no quietness. Which gate has cat gone?" "It's take through garden edge," said Ben. "And you getting the bag?" "Aye," replied the miller, "I have it here. Go but fur up lane, out at sight of yon woman. Our Johnny'll look after cat. I'll bring it directly." As soon as Ben was out of sight, the miller slipped into the stable, and wrapping a piece of wood in a handful of hay, he put it into the bag and tied up the mouth, and then he limped across the corner of the field and handed the bag down over a low thorn hedge to Ben, who was waiting in the lane below. "There it is," said the miller. "Off with ye now, and tell Jem I dunna like the breed of his bantams. I'd rather have a two-legged un. Yon woman of ours is quite reet. We han a cat at our house. Off with thou, and tell him I'll call as soon as me foot's well." Ben was willing enough to go, and he lost no time about it, for he'd been detained longer than he expected. The scene in the miller's kitchen had bewildered his simple mind, and as he urged Dimple up the lane, thoughts of witchcraft came over him, and he gave many a glance at the pannier where the cat was, thinking to himself that the devil took so many shapes that there was no knowing. Beside, he'd always heard that the form of a cat was one of his favourite disguises. He stopped now and then and listened, for he fancied he heard a weird mew, and then he hurried on again, anxious to get rid of his charge. Billy Fairhouse was leaning upon his garden gate, waiting, as Ben came towards his cottage on his way back. Behind a holly bush beside him, the old man had the duplicate bag containing the Bantam, ready for exchange. "Whoa," said Ben, stopping his jackass in front of the gate. Then, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, he looked up at the old man and said, "I've been." "Well," replied Billy, "were he in?" "In? Aye, but what dun you think it were?" "What were?" "The Bantam. A spreckled un, happen." "Spreckled be damned," replied Ben. Then, going up the steps, he whispered to the old man, "It were a cat." "What, sister?" replied the old man, staring with feigned astonishment. "It's a cat, I tell you, black un," continued Ben in a whisper, "and I want to get rid on it. Is that letter ready?" "Aye," replied Billy. "Slip round to the kitchen, I'll find a pont dresser." The moment Ben was off at the end of the garden edge, old Billy whipped up the bag containing the Bantam, and exchanged it for one in the pannier, which contained, as he supposed, his own cat. Then he took up his pipe and leaned upon the gate again, and when Ben came back with the note in his hand, the old man was smoking and looking round at the fields the same as before. "Didst to find it?" said Billy. "Aye," replied Ben, holding the note up. "It's here." "Well then," continued Billy, "off without, and land that cat where it come from as soon as ta con. I don't much like on it." "No, nor me neither," replied Ben. "There's summat more uncommon about this doomant." "Art sure it were a cat?" inquired Billy. "A cat, aye," said Ben. "Look at me hand by thectum. You should have seen how it tackled yon dog at Miller's. He'd have such ado in that hole." "Well, away with thou and get it back to Bull's Head as fast as thou can." "I will do so," answered Ben, laying hold of the bridle. "I will do so. Good morning to you." "Good morning," replied Billy, as he watched them up the road. "Come on, Dimple," said Ben, pulling at the bridle. "Let's get this job o'er and be off. Thou little knows what there is in that thing upon thy back. I wonder what they'll have to carry next." And for the rest of the way he was too uneasy in mind to enjoy the beauty of the season smiling around him in earth and sky. The landlord at the Bull's Head had been watching some time through the window for Ben's return, and several of the customers who were in when he started were still waiting to see the fun. In addition to these, several of the neighbours had been sent for, and they were all noisily merry together, when the landlord, who had caught sight of Ben in the distance, cried, "Hush, lads, he's coming. Sit still. He isn't above 50 yards off. Be talking about summat else. I'll go and meet him at door." "Well, tha's getting back," said the landlord, handing a shilling to Ben as he came up to the door with his jackass. "What said he?" "What said he?" replied Ben, as he put the shilling in his pocket. "He sent it back. It had turned into a cat when I get there." "A cat? The lies be like." "It were a cat, I tell you," continued Ben. "It were a Bantam here, right enough, but it were a cat when it get to t'other end, and a pummer too. Look at me hand." "Well, come, bring it in," replied the landlord. "Nay," said Ben, "I'll have no more truck with it. It's there. Take it for yourself." "What, that no I'm flayed of a cat, arter," continued the landlord. "I'm flayed of that cat. replied Ben. "Come, I'll get it," said the landlord, going to the pannier and taking the bag out. "Now then," said he to Ben, "come in a minute and let's see what mack of a cat it is. It'll happen come in for Joe of all sorts. He wants one." "Now then," said the landlord, beginning to unloose the bag when he got into the tap room. "Stop fur, lads, and shut door." "Out a minute," cried Ben. "Look out, it'll fly at some on you. Here, let me get upon table. Now then, mind your hats. It's a divil, is that. Open that door and let's have room for running." The landlord turned the bag upside down, and out rolled a little strutting bantam, as proud as a Highland piper. "Well, by mass," said Ben, staring, first at the bantam and then at the bag. Then, jumping down from the table and darting out at the door, he shouted, "I'm off at Nook," and seizing Dimple's bridle, he hurried up the road as fast as he could go. The place rang with laughter when Ben ran out. The landlord ran after him, but Ben was away. He jumped up behind the panniers, and Dimple was galloping off with him. "By mass," said Ben, glancing back when he got some distance from the house, "that's a crumper." And then he jumped down, and wiping the sweat from his brow, he went thoughtfully on by the side of Dimple towards the village of Shawclough, still looking back now and then with an indefinite fear of something or another in the rearward.